Welcome to Shaping Citizens. Thank you for joining us here, either via Zoom or Facebook Live. This event is part of Filipinas Heritage Library's Liberation, War, and Hope program, a series of events held in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Presented by the Ayala Foundation, Filipinas Heritage Library, and the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines. Let us begin our program by singing the Philippine National Anthem to be followed by the U.S. National Anthem.
Tumayo po tayong lahat, ilagay ang kanang kamay sa ating dibdib, at sabay-sabay nating awitin ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Bayang magiliw, perlas ng silanganan, alab ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyang ka ng magiting, sa manlulupi, di ka pasisiil, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bughaw, may dilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kisap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng luwalhati pagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Good morning once again to our viewers in the Philippines, and hello to everyone watching from around the world. I am Sofia Santiago, and I am your host for today's event. Shaping Citizens is presented by Filipinas Heritage Library, or FHL, a Filipiniana library managed by Ayala Foundation. Its mission is to spark and stoke interest in the visual, oral, and printed story of the Filipino through its collections of documentary heritage materials in the form of books, periodicals, documents, photographs, music, videos, and digital resources. FHL has been organizing programs related to World War II, such as exhibitions, lectures, and film screenings, in connection with the library's Roderick Hall collection of books and materials on World War II in the Philippines. These materials were entrusted to FHL by Mr. Roderick Hall, a World War II survivor who has been generously supporting the library's World War II collection and programs to raise awareness about the struggles and contributions of our people during the war. Let us now hear the welcome remarks of Ayala Foundation's Senior Director for Arts and Culture, Ms. Mariles Gustilo, to be followed by a message from our partner, the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines, represented by their Cultural Affairs Officer, Ms. Nina Lewis.
Good morning and welcome to Shaping City Sense, a webinar organized by the Filipinas Heritage Library as part of its Liberation Talks program and co-presented by the United States Embassy. The current pandemic has changed the stance toward urban density, renewing public interest in the rapid urban sprawl of our country, putting the spotlight on legacies that include heritage sites, as well as other forms of everyday activity and sociable gatherings. Today, we are joined by three of the best in the field of our nation's urban history: Paulo Alcazaren, Meloy Mabunay, and Noelle Rodriguez, discussing respectively Makati, Iloilo, and Zamboanga, using primary sources from their personal archives, as well as the library's Roderick Hall collection. The three historians bring to life a tale of three cities and its citizenry. City sense is a sense of belonging to a community that helps city dwellers consolidate who they are, identifying with their cities, strengthens civic feeling, and fosters pride in being Filipino. We hope that this webinar will instill realization that our cities and our citizens are worthy of care. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm delighted to speak with you today alongside distinguished historians, architect Paulo Alcazaren, Dr. Ma Luisa Meloy Mabunay, and Dr. Felice Noelle Rodriguez. I'd like to also acknowledge the Filipinas Heritage Library team, led by Mr. John Labella, whose work and dedication have propelled us to continue conducting virtual programs to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Philippines. Of course, we wish we could be with you in person, but virtual has been a fantastic way to conduct these programs, and we're happy to be here and working together. Today, we're all part of history, a history that none of us expected, being part of the global COVID-19 pandemic, something that none of us thought was possible a year and a half ago. Right now, I think we're all patiently waiting to receive the vaccine, and that's giving us hope of a brighter future on the horizon. 1,000 tomorrows after today, we'll continue to remember those that we lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Just like our forefathers, along with the veterans and their families who endured the most unbearable conditions during World War II, we lost so many, but the end of the war sparked a glimmer of courage, allowing hope and forward momentum. The profound and moving stories of the men, women, and children who survived the devastation of the war remind us of the power and resilience of the human spirit. The unbreakable bond between Filipinos and Americans that formed during the war reminds us that together we can overcome even the most difficult times. I personally lost a great uncle, my grandmother's brother, here in the Philippines during World War II. And now I regularly am able to visit his grave at the American Cemetery in Manila. I encourage all of you who are able to visit the American Cemetery, where you can learn more about our shared history. Immediately after the war, Filipinos and Americans began rebuilding. And the key to that rebuilding was the preservation of knowledge and the education of youth. This helped us fulfill the promise of a better future. Together, Filipinos and Americans endured the trauma and hardship of World War II. And together, we worked to rebuild. And I think we grew closer as we did. The alliance that our people forged during World War II continues to unite and inspire Filipinos and Americans. This webinar examines how the shaping of citizens occurs alongside cultivating their city sense. Showing this link are the expansions, improvements, and uses of streets, plazas, and other public spaces. Shaping City Sense traces the sense of community that helps city dwellers consolidate who they are, their identification with processes in and shapes of their cities strengthen civic feeling, the care for these places, and for the nation as a whole. Reflecting on our shared history and sacrifice at events like this one deepens my faith in the continued promise of the US-Philippine relationship. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Miss Mariles Gustilo and Miss Nina Lewis, for the insightful and inspirational messages. Now, let me introduce to you our first speaker for today. Urban designer, landscape architect, and urban historian, Paulo Alcazaren is a principal of PDAA Creative Design and PDAA Group International and a Philippine Star columnist. He has authored books and scholarly articles on architecture, design, and urban history. For his writing, he has won the Alab ng Haraya Award from the NCCA. He also curates exhibitions, and various institutions have showcased his architectural photography. His advocacies are in heritage conservation, public parks, and open spaces. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you architect Paulo Alcazaren. Hi, Sir Paulo. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Sophia, and good morning to everyone. Let me share my screen. First of all, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the Ayala Foundation Incorporated, the Filipinos Heritage Library, and the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines for allowing me to share with you this morning a talk on Shaping City Sense, Makati. I'm Paulo Alcazaren. I'm the principal of PGAA Creative Design. Let me start by paraphrasing Churchill and Dr. Jose Rizal. We shape our cities, then our cities shape us. And paraphrasing Rizal, if we don't know our cities' past, we cannot prepare them for a sustainable future. To make sense then of Makati, we need to look at its past in the larger context of metropolitan Manila's history. And that history starts with Intramuros, the capital, which set the template for urbanism in the Spanish era with a grid, the quadricula, set by the laws of the Indies from the 17th to the 19th century. So this organized our urban areas in Manila and in the whole of the Philippines in a geometry that focused around open spaces, which were the plazas. The plazas were the locus of economic, political, and social life. Central urban spaces defined by buildings of importance, of church and state, as well as residences of the ruling and upper classes. This is late 19th century Manila and its arrabales, so suburbs, San Nicolas, Tondo, Binondo, Santa Cruz, Quiapo, San Miguel, Sampaloc, Ermita, Malate, and Paco, with a population of 250,000 at the end of the Spanish colonial era in 1898 as we transitioned from the Spanish to the American colonial era. Urbanism started to improve the capital in the wake of globalization that was spurred by trade, as well as the opening of the Suez Canal in 1861. This is the American colonial era master plan for Manila. The American insular government retained the services of Daniel Burnham for a city beautiful plan for Manila, and Burnham planned this for 800,000 people. Daniel Burnham and his associate Pierce Anderson came over in late 1904 and proceeded to stay for about 5 weeks, returning to the United States to produce a plan that was approved by the US Congress in 1905. And then he suggested that the government retain the services of the Yale graduate William E. Parsons, who oversaw the plan at least in the first 6 or 7 years until he went back to the United States. This is the master plan in 1905, which was patterned after Washington, D.C.'s master plan, the Macmillan Plan of 1901, which was prepared by Daniel Burnham, Charles McKean, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Augusto St. Gaudens. So you see the similarities between the two. our Washington Mall was supposed to be the Luneta. And we were supposed to have a Capitol at the end of this Baroque axis with the memorial at the other end. Instead of Washington, we had Rizal. If we had built the proposed Capitol, it would have cost us only 10 million pesos over 100 years ago. But unfortunately, the history of our 12 or so master plans for Manila was a lack of political will or the vagaries of history that this allowed us to implement almost all of the plans prepared for the capital. Other plans were, in fact, prepared for cities and towns all over the country. Baguio, Zamboanga, Cebu, and others continued to be produced by the Bureau of Public Works, which from 1918 onwards was manned by Filipino architects trained in the United States, like Juan Arellano, Tomas Mupua, Antonio Toledo. Despite the master plan being only partially completed, Manila was provided with key infrastructure and landmarks like the post office, the Jones Bridge, and the Metropolitan Theater. Within the Mahan Gardens, the Metropolitan Theater was just re-inaugurated a few days ago. Manila was as beautiful as Paris. That's Manila, that's Paris. And it had a tranvia system that carried up to 7 million passengers a year. These are my favorite posters from Manila of that era. In the 1930s, Manila was a pearl of the Orient, the destination of choice for cruise ships and airlines, as Singapore and Hong Kong were just backwaters then. Manila was getting congested by the 1930s with its population approaching 700,000. The Commonwealth government of Manuel L. Quezon planned to move the capital in the anticipation of further growth and eventual independence. So you see the Intramuros, the Jones Bridge, Binondo, Arroceros, Santa Cruz, Quiapo, Sampaloc, and the UST complex in the horizon. So Manila had filled out and there was need to move, also because of fears of invasion from nations surrounding the Philippines. This is the 1941 Frost Arellano plan for Quezon City, which moved the capital 15 kilometers inland. And they retained the services of Harry Frost, who was a partner of Bennett Parsons of Frost in Chicago. And he worked with Juan Arellano as well as Louis P. Croft, a planner and landscape architect that who was working for the national government at the time. This is a detail of the 1941 Frost Arellano Croft plan for Quezon City, showing that it was a city beautiful writ large and organized around a large 400-hectare quadrangle defined by North Avenue, South Avenue, East South Avenue, and West Avenue, where we were supposed to have a national capital in the elliptical with a new Malacanang Palace, Halls of Justice, and a 1,000-hectare University of the Philippines. The Quezon City plan was approved by the Philippine legislature and was actually started right before the war. This is the Diliman Quadrangle in UP, with ground broken for the new capital at the Elliptica. So that's the University of the Philippines, North Avenue, East Avenue, EDSA, which was originally called 19 de Junio, the birthday of Rizal, and Quezon Boulevard. Unfortunately, war came upon us. This is the Philippine Army under Field Marshal Douglas MacArthur. And what happened is during the liberation and we were casualties of the war, this is a 500-pound bomb heading its way to Intramuros. And the infrastructure that had been built in the first 50 years of the 20th century became this. Manila and key cities were heavily damaged in the war. The United States aided in rebuilding with funds for key government buildings in the central government area, as well as the UP Padre Faura, as well as Manila's main roads and bridges. The US lent planners as well as personnel from the US Bureau of Roads to assist the National Urban Planning Commission and the Bureau of Public Works. Harvard alumni Louis Croft, Antonio Cayanan, and Anselmo Alquinto, third, eighth, and ninth from the right, formed the National Urban Planning Commission, which eventually became the National Planning Commission. They aided the government in setting up the new capital of the Philippines, including a study for possible alternative capital sites in 1941 that included Baguio, Manila, Novaliches, San Mateo, Bataan, Quezon City, Montalban, Antipolo, even Camp McKinley or Fort McKinley, Canlubang, Tagaytay, Nagcarlang, San Tomas, Lipa, Cebu, Iloilo, and Davao. They even figured that maybe they should consider the geographical center of the Philippines, which they found to be just off a small unknown island called Boracay. Unfortunately, almost all of these alternative sites was lacking in infrastructure, and eventually Novaliches was chosen and augmented into Quezon City as the site for the national capital. And this was signed, the 1949 Quezon City Master Plan was signed by Elpidio Quirino. The 49 plan had several iterations, including major ones in 55 and 56 and one in 59 under Anselmo Quinto of the National Planning Commission. And this shows you the plan in 56, showing an Avenue of the Republic as the main spine leading to a capital complex flanked by the new Malacanang and Justice, overlooking the Marikina Valley, which the planners had suggested be bought by government and refrained from urban development, because they knew that the West Valley fault line was there, and to provide a vista for everyone coming to the capital complex. But please note, the central spine was where on both sides, all of the commercial buildings were supposed to transfer from Manila. And behind those, the two rows flanking the Avenue of Republic were supposed to be residential enclaves for civil servants as well as the general public. Remember this pattern because this pattern was never fully implemented and led to others, mainly the private corporations, to carry on what Quezon City had failed to do. So unfortunately, very little infrastructure was built for Quezon City, its national government center, and the rest of the city in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the planned central business district was never built in Novaliches. This is where Makati steps in. So as the new capital, Quezon City, was not being developed adequately, Makati offered close to 1,650 hectares as an alternative for residential, industrial, and commercial development, leaving civic functions to Manila and Quezon City. We have to step back a bit in the late Spanish period, and this is a plan of Manila then, showing Makati, or the Hacienda de San Pedro Makati, which was originally quite large. And this is the former estate of Capitan Pedro de Brito and the Jesuits, which were bought by Jose Bonifacio Rojas, a partner of Ayala y Compañía in 1851. And eventually the hacienda was inherited by Jacobo, Alfonso, and Mercedes Ayala de Rojas in 1911. The hacienda was mainly agricultural, but pottery and brick for construction were also made there. The area was also the source of another building material, which is adobe. Adobe from Makati actually built Manila and was the source of stone, which was barged through the Pasig River to Intramuros and the rest of Manila, which used the stone for building. Although rice was grown in the hacienda, the yields were disappointing. The hacienda was more successful growing fodder grass or zacate, which fed the horses that pulled the tranvias as a wild franchise originally, as well as the calesas and most transport in 19th century Manila. So the original Zobel franchise tranvias involved horse-drawn tranvias, as electricity was not introduced until the last decade of the 19th century. Makati was a hacienda town of 3,000 people at the turn of the century, and most of them were employed by Ayala y Compañía. This is Makati, which was, and most of the settlement was by the Pasig River. This is an azotea overlooking the Pasig at the time. This is the population of Makati with the Church of St. Peter and Paul on the right, and most everyone surrounding it. And surrounding that were the zacate and rice fields. This is the head office of the Hacienda de San Pedro Makati. But in the late 20s and early 1930s, urbanization approached the small sleepy town with introductions of things like the railway line from Manila to Fort McKinley, which is today's Kalayaan Avenue, and of course the airfield. And to make better use of the hacienda in the 1930s, in 1926 the first subdivisions were built. In 1937, a 43-hectare Nielsen Airport franchise lease was opened. That's the South Cemetery, Santa Ana Racetrack, Pasig River, the original Olympia and Consuelo subdivisions, and the railway from Manila to Fort McKinley, and that's the site of Poblacion Makati. Nielsen Airfield operated from 1937 to 1941 and from 1946 to 48. It closed in 48 when government consolidated all operations to Nichols Field in Pasay City. So the Ayala company embarked on real estate development to service post-war growth. This is an evolution of the zoning of Makati, which was introduced and headed by Joseph McMicking, who with Alfonso Savell and Jaime Velasquez oversaw the master planning of the area and introduced key concepts like strict zoning with deed restrictions and administration, estate management and administration. And it sought to provide alternative industrial locations surrounded by what they called uncontrolled housing, which was for lower income and workers of the industrial sites, but also a central business district. And this is very interesting, on both sides of a wide avenue, replicating the Quezon City plan, but without the civic center. And behind those controlled residential areas, this is the original plan. This is the development of the plan and the 1950s, showing the villages as well as Ayala Avenue and the commercial center in single-use zoning areas around what used to be the airport runways. So Makati's planners were influenced in the residential zones by garden suburbs planning movement in the US, espoused by planners like the Olmsted brothers, John Nolan and others, as well as post-war guidelines prescribed by groups like the Urban Land Institute. So you see the geometry and the pattern of those 30s, 40s, and 50s style of planning, which is reflected in the villages that were built and developed around the central business district of Makati. This is Forest Park South in 48 and the 50s, and industrial developments which happened in 1949 and the 1960s. So San Lorenzo started in 54, Urdaneta Village in 57, the Bel Air villages from the 50s to the 60s, San Miguel Village in 1960, Dasma in 62, Magallanes in 66, and Palm Village in the 1960s. So this is another aerial shot showing the northeastern section of Makati in the early 60s, showing Bel Air villages, Poblacion and Rockwell power plant on the upper left, which was essential, and it was a 130 megawatt facility essential in providing electricity to industrial and residential developments in the area. Of course, this was moved to Laguna in the 1970s. The 1950s saw the introduction of modernist architecture in office and industrial buildings, as well as new building types like multi-story apartment buildings and condominiums. In fact, Joseph McMicking was the one who introduced the concept of the CCT, or condominium certificate title, as well as strict implementation of zoning regulations through deed of restrictions. This is Aircon Philippines that looked like an aircon, and that's the original first high-rise apartment, which is Monterey Apartments by Leandro Locsin. Makati's development in the 50s to the 60s led to the flourishing of a golden age modernist architecture and planning in the country. Many of these exemplary buildings are featured in local and international publication, like the Philippine Arts and Architecture Journal. And that's the Amon Trading Building by A.J. Luz with the Makati building on the left by Leandro Locsin. A post-war generation of Filipino architects were the creative force behind this wave of modernism. These are the founders of the Architectural Club Incorporated, Gabriel Formosa from the left, AJ Luz, Carlos Arguelles, Florencio Fardo, Manuel Manyosa, Angel Nakpil, and Luis Araneta. Most, uh, most of these architects, and including Cesar Concho, Jose Zaragoza, national artist, as well as national artist Juan Nakpil, national artist Leandro Luxin, and national artist Ildefonso Santos. They were all schooled in the United States, or in the case of Leandro Luxin, embarked on a study tour of the US, where he was influenced and met uh, key architects of the time, Paul Rudolph and Eros Saarinen. This is the Insular Life building, completed in 1961 by Cesar Poncho at 66 meters. It was the tallest building in the country. 66 meters or 12 stories was the limit suggested by the Makati Development Corporation because of the limitations of technology at the time. Of course, this was extended in the 80s and 90s. So now we have 40 to 50-story buildings because of technology. This is the Asian Institute of Management in 69 by Gabriel Formoso. And the Ayala company introduced a lot of educational institutions, including Don Bosco, Assumption, and others, just to also to service the residential areas. This is the Ayala Museum, or the original one by Leandro Roxin in 74. And by the 1960s, the center of Manila's business and social life shifted from Manila to Makati. And these are the executives behind it, without, of course, Alfonso, but you have Jaime Velasquez on the left, and Joseph McMeeking on the roof deck of the old Ayala building overlooking Makati. And McMeeking was famous when he gave talks to boost the investment in the area for giving what he called the salami talk. And he likened the old way of real estate development in Manila before Makati as a butcher just chopping off slices of the salami and just selling it to buyers without any thought to what happens afterwards. So Makati, under Joseph McMeeking and Velasquez and Sobel, took a different stance of taking care of what investments people brought in. And this is by way of zoning, deed restrictions, and estate management. This is Ayala Avenue in 1967, showing that main spine that I showed you. So the failure of Quezon City led to the success of developers like Ayala in Makati, of course, also eventually in places like Ortigas and Cubao to lesser extents, but they were following precedents set by the Ayala company. The Gaspi villages and Salcedo villages behind them, this main spine, were supposed to be residential, although the very success of this development led to the start of mixed-use developments in those areas. So this is the Hotel Intercontinental and Makati Commercial Center in 69, the Intercon by Leandro Locsin, and the landscape designs for both Intercon and the Makati Commercial Center by Ildefonso P. Santos. And I worked for him in this building in the center of the picture, the Doña Narcisa building. I worked for him for 4 years, from 78 to 82. This is Paseo de Rojas and Ugarte football field. We used to go down and watch the football games in 69. And this is an aerial panorama of Ayala as it developed in the 1970s, showing the fulfillment of the original master plan started in 47, 48. By the mid-60s, Ayala Avenue became the Wall Street of Greater Manila. Offices on both sides, created a single zone use that was a goal of modern planning practice, but created no life after office hours. Past 6 o'clock, it was devoid of life, and that was one of its drawbacks, which were corrected in the decades afterwards with the introduction of mixed use. This is the Makati Commercial Center, which is also a single-use zone, controlled commercial areas that sought to remove the problems of Avenida Rizal in a more modern way of putting together commercial establishments. And this is another picture of the site. This is the Sulu by the Manyosa brothers. And the landmarks of SM, the first SM department store is South Theater by Nakpil and Insular Life by Concho. The landscape of IP Santos and introduction of new typologies like pedestrian shopping arcades and supermarkets surrounded by generous parking. And in the introduction of modern public art embedded, introduced a generation of Philippine sculptors, providing a sense of place for commercial and business districts. The Glorieta in Makati and the introduction of Greenbelt Park and Aviary, art-filled pedestrian shopping malls designed by landscape architect, national artist IP Santos. Success was defined in the 60s then as an executive job in Makati driving a car, and cars and architecture were marketed to middle class using Makati backdrops. A future in Makati became aspirational for youth. These are the info-life scholars, as well as the young. This is the 1963 Time awardees photograph on Ayala Avenue. White-collar workforce, first men and eventually women, were introduced and became the norm in the new central business district. And in fact, it also became a fashion shoot location for modern fashion in Magallanes, in Ayala. And eventually, Makati was celebrated in film. This is Working Girls by Ismael Bernal, which was social commentary because of the times in 1984. And I don't know if Ismael Bernal consciously used the yellow taxi cabs as a political statement. But politics and the site of Makati became a venue for protest. And post people power revolution into the 90s, Makati developed further to establish itself as the nation's premier business district. Since 2000, Makati has changed into a 24/7 mixed-use district with diverse architecture supporting vibrant urban life. This is the Makati Museum, home of the Philippines Heritage Library, which will reopen later this year. In the last 2 decades, Makati CBD has evolved from single-use zones to mixed-use districts that allow more sustainable development with better connectivity, walkability, and infrastructure. That's Legazpi Village. This is overlooking the triangle, and high-quality, well-maintained urban design in Makati is ensured by a proactive property owner association, Masaya, residential village associations, and collaboration with the LGU. Infrastructure has been upgraded to 21st century standard for urban design and landscape architecture. BRTs and a subway are in construction to connect Makati with the larger metropolitan area surrounding it. Pedestrian improvements with urban patios has won awards for placemaking and urban design. And you can walk to anywhere in the district. Makati has set standards for urban cleaning and open space in both mixed-use districts and individual residential parks. This is a Salcedo Village Park. Coming for Silker, the Silker Makati, beside the original Ayala y Compañía subdivision, has made sure that the improvements have spread throughout the now city of Makati. So then, Makati was a product of historical factors of our post-independence trajectory, identifying needs and providing rational alternatives that have evolved in the last half century. It continues to reshape itself, the people who live, work, and play there, as well as the larger metropolis itself. So I end paraphrasing Socrates, only a city that makes sense is one worth living in. Thank you and keep safe.
That was wonderful. That was heavy, wonderful, insightful, all in one go. Thank you so much, Sir Paulo. I especially love the pictures of the Nielsen Airfield, and of course the Ayala Museum, the first and the current addresses of the Filipinas Heritage Library. We hope you guys watching via Zoom or Facebook can visit us soon and see the renovated space when we reopen after 2 years, almost 2 years. Our next speaker is former Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of the Philippines, Visayas, at Miagao, Iloilo, Dr. Maria Luisa Meloy Mabunay, who is a scholar of local Philippine history. Her work cuts across the fields of gender and women's studies, coastal resources management, and Japanese studies. Her major contributions are on early 20th century settlement of the Japanese in Panay, their wartime experiences, and their descendants in Japan and in the Philippines. As well, she has investigated the Japanese occupation of Panay. She continues her inquiry on Iloilo, integrating her prior research endeavors into a larger project on the city's history. Doc Meloy, you may now begin. Good morning. Hi.
Hi, thank you, Sophia. Good day, everyone. First, let me express my gratitude to our hosts and sponsors for the privilege of being here with you, all of you today. This 1848 plan shows the Iloilo of yore, with a settlement not much more than a fishing village. It was a narrow town with little land for habitation or permanent construction. East of the village and next to the river mouth, manglares or mangroves filled a broad swamp. On any map, it is easy to recognize the nose-like shape near the river mouth. This feature suggests why this place has been called the Malay or native name Irong Irong, referring to the nose, the Spanish La Punta or the tip, and Spanish adaptations of Ilong Ilong, Iloilo, and finally, the anglicized Iloilo. Because of these name changes, confusion easily can befall anyone digging into records and books on the city's history. What defines a city, however, goes beyond its name. Inviting parallels with features shared by other cities worldwide, I explore Iloilo's past through its landmarks, nodes, districts, paths, and edges. My stroll through time begins with the Presidencia, northwest of Plaza Libertad. And from the plaza in the south, I move on to Casa Gobierno back in the north. Tracing the Muelle Road along the river from the Casa Gobierno to the Customs House, I recall developments at the harbor and then conclude with the fort or fuerza. All these iconic places give the sense of the city's transformations under Spain and America and until the Philippine Republic rose from the ashes of the Second World War. Grown from a Spanish naval garrison and mission area, Iloilo's present urban form hinges on its having become an entrepot for sugar, a commodity that had a high demand and price in the global market at the turn of the 1900s. By the 19th century, the Spanish bureaucracy used town halls to centralize its administration in the colony. These town halls were variously called Tribunal, Municipio, or Presidencia. This photo taken in 1928 shows the old municipio at Arevalo Plaza, one of Iloilo's urban nodes. The town heads perform their duties in permanent structures such as this. The American Commonwealth government raised Iloilo's rank to that of a chartered city on July 16, 1937, incorporating the neighboring towns of Arevalo, Haro, La Paz, Molo, and Mandurriao. The special charter recognized Iloilo's status as the leading city in the Visayas and Mindanao. 6 others like Iloilo gained special charters: Bacolod, Cebu, Davao, Quezon City, Zamboanga, and Tagaytay. In 1936, a year prior to Iloilo's attainment of city status, the new Presidencia was opened. Though plans for it began in 1908, what enabled its construction was a land donation from Juliana Meliza in 1928. The new Presidencia was to be the center of the chartered city, being envisioned with a new city plan. As early as 1926, architect Juan Arellano of the Bureau of Public Works was charged to draft an urban plan for Iloilo's expansion across the towns that the charter would incorporate into it. The American colonial government since 1919 had appointed Filipinos to head the bureau. This map represents the street system when Iloilo became a chartered city in 1936. It focuses on the southeastern district now known as the city proper. More than just the central business district, it is also recognized as Iloilo's historic node. That phrase is especially apt when we consider how the city would have expanded with Arellano's City Beautiful plan shown in the next slide. The 1930 Arellano plan is superimposed here on a 1956 Namria map. The Southern Historic District was the site from which new nodes would have sprung. The northwestern part beyond the city proper would provide growth centers for the additional towns. The plan adds 3 bridges leading to new development. These new paths connect the areas north of the river to the traditional centers along the Muelle and the Calle Real. The plan also highlights passage between the southern and northern landmarks of Plaza Libertad and Casa Gobierno. The new Presidencia or City Hall along Delgado Street, which is now UP Visayas, seen in this photo, and the adjacent area of Tansa would have been the new civic and recreational park. The Presidencia overlooks Guimaras across the Iloilo Strait. The Arellano plan conceived this neoclassical building to be the core stimulant to the city's building program. Though market-driven, it asserted the city's political and cultural authority. The Iloilo Municipal or City Hall was deemed to be the largest building in the Visayas and Mindanao during the Commonwealth period. It looks compact and yet dominates the surrounding countryside. The building included office spaces for the Presidente or later the Mayor, the Municipal Council, the Treasury, the Justice of Peace, the Fire Department, a courtroom, and even jail cells and modern toilets. During construction, significant adjustments were made to stabilize the foundation of load-bearing areas. Footings were increased in low portions to reach stable soil strata under the marshy ground. Openings for light and ventilation were prominent in the design. As a whole, the enhancement of the cityscape was a tool for shaping and controlling both the environment and colonial subjects. It made urban spaces utilitarian, rational, and civic-oriented. The citizens implicit in this new urban landscape rose in stark contrast to the older plaza complexes which vaunted the military and religious aspects of Spanish colonization. The City Beautiful movement, which Arellano advocated, sought to improve the living conditions and civic virtues of the urban dweller. It used urban planning to engineer economic, social, political, and cultural interactions, exemplified by the fire hydrant on this prominent corner of J.M. Basa Street or the old Calle Real. The Arellano plan already projected the enhancement of the waterfront, creating stronger links between this node and the other centers of the city and neighboring towns. Unfortunately, declining sugar transshipments and labor unrest in the late 1930s, as well as the Second World War, derailed its implementation. The Plaza Complex was a distinctive feature of Spanish urban planning. Soon after the Spanish conquest of Manila, the 1573 royal ordinances concerning the laying out of new towns provided officials with a blueprint for towns and cities. In these ordinances, the parish church was a central colonial institution, and the plaza fronting it was used as a center for religious proselytization, cultural indoctrination, and political control. Through urban design, Spanish officials aimed to bring all of the Indios within hearing distance of the church bell, hence the phrase bajo de la campana or under the bell. The Plaza of Haro, with its dominant belfry, is today an enduring landmark that illustrates the plaza complex. Other built forms around the plaza were organized into symmetrical grid patterns, as this image of the Iloilo's Plaza Mayor illustrates. Once called Plaza de Alfonso XII after the Spanish king, and now called Plaza Libertad, this southern historic node still holds traces of Spanish power manifested through urban planning. Note Iloilo's parish church, the San Jose Church, on the left. In 1890, the Iloilo Ayuntamiento sought to improve the city. The architect Antonio Domenech, under the city government's direction, came up with an 1893 urban plan. The plan brought changes to the plaza. Cement benches with marble were installed, and wells were opened to irrigate the gardens. The plaza became a place for Sunday promenades and holiday gatherings. During those years, bullfights also took place in a stadium there. Only Manila and Iloilo held such juegos de toros. Jose Rizal in 1901, under the first American civil governor William Howard Taft, gained the title of Philippine National Hero, and Rizal's death anniversary became an official holiday. American modifications of the plaza complex usually added a bandstand, a perimeter fence, an artesian well, a sports court, and the hero's statue. In Iloilo on December 30, 1907, an imposing Rizal statue was added to Plaza Libertad as its central monument. The Plaza Mayor fronting the San Jose Church was a node initially devoted to the community's religious activities. And yet, from a simple place for religious practice and leisure to a site of military and political exercises, the Philippine Plaza continues to evolve. North of Plaza Libertad is Casa Gobierno, which is today the provincial capital of Iloilo. The photo shows what the capital looked like in 1901, where the Isnart and General Luna streets now intersect. Since its completion in the Spanish period, this landmark has gone through many physical as well as name changes. Casa Gobierno de Iloilo, Palacio del Gobernador, Casa Real, Provincial Building of Iloilo, President Garcia Hall, and today, Provincial Capital of Iloilo. Under American administration, Panay Island was divided into the provinces of Antique, Capiz, and Iloilo. Iloilo then included today's island province of Guimaras. Casa Gobierno, once damaged in the Philippine-American War, returned to prominence as the center of provincial governance. Apart from inter-provincial road connections, Iloilo was linked to the capital towns of Capiz by the Philippine National Railway. With major stops at Pototan and Pasig, the railway served both passengers and the transport of sugar products to warehouses in Iloilo. Note the two flags. The Americans promised Philippinization, offering Filipinos free elections, local office, and their own national assembly. Though American officials initially controlled these processes, Filipinos would enact legislation and administer with some autonomy. The Taft Commission remodeled the Philippine government, instituting the basic civil law for municipal and provincial governments along the lines of American statecraft. Province-wide meetings gathered municipal presidents, treasurers, and police chiefs. Initially appointed governor of Iloilo Province and elected on March 3, 1902, Martin Delgado poses here with town presidents. As governor of Iloilo, Delgado supervised major construction and repair of the path network of the province, with the dual purpose of providing good roads and job creation for the common people. Starting in the early 1900s, Iloilo officials widened the streets and installed the electric grid in the commercial district. Electric lights began to line Plaza Libertad along J.M. Basa or the old Calle Real into Plazoleta Gay, and from the Isnart intersection towards the northern center around the Casa Gobierno. Secular facilities rose amid the emphasis on civil governance over Spanish Catholicism. Built for the first time across the country, some of these facilities were municipal halls alongside plazas, public markets, and public elementary schools. In American adaptations of the Spanish Plaza, the market was moved away from business centers. Commonwealth officials strove to build permanent markets with sanitary facilities. And in time, these replaced the weekly town markets with itinerant traders from various towns. Only the Huebesan of Haro continues to thrive. A much larger, imposing Iloilo Central Market replaced the old one shown earlier along Calle Santo Niño. The Art Deco facade shown in these two photographs by Paulo Alcazaren faced the junction of Calle Esnart and what is now Rizal Street. The modernization of Philippine cities was made synonymous with Americanization, using images of the American scenery, housekeeping, and lifestyle that conveyed ideas about space and living. Not only were the building materials and the scale new to the Philippines, but so were the building types and designs. Architecture and urban planning became a means to promote American values as better than those of other Western colonizers in the tropics. Such values at times were not enthusiastically received. The Arroyo Fountain here was named after the Ilonggo Senator Jose Maria Arroyo. Completed in 1927 and marking the kilometer zero for measuring distances in the city, the caryatids presiding over this landmark celebrate the installation of the Iloilo Metropolitan Waterworks System in 1925, but they provoked agitation among Catholic women's organizations, prompting changes in their sculpted garments. For the most part, large-scale concrete structures, roadways, roads, and bridges in Philippine cities were government projects. A case in point is the American transformation of the waterfront or quay, now called the Muelle Loni. The path that linked the landmark of the Casa Gobierno in the northern node and beyond the Iloilo Customs House at the southern node. Iloilo City gradually became an international entrepot from the mid-19th century to the Second World War, and the rows of warehouses at the Muelle district speak volumes of the significance of the city's sugar trade. Development since the mid-19th century prioritized sugar production and trade in the Western Visayas region well into the American era. These changes came only after Spain shifted from its reliance on the Manila-Acapulco trade of Chinese products. However, these changes proved to be detrimental to the then vibrant production and trade of hand-woven textiles that also reached foreign markets. More liberal policies then allowed international trade and other colonial powers access to Manila in 1834 and into Iloilo in 1855. With the invention of steamships and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the sugar industry boosted Iloilo's status and prosperity. As well, the Muelle was the district where the Iloilo port or harbor was found, with its docks, jetties, and wharves, and of course, the sugar warehouses. The imposing landmark of the Muelle in the Muelle district is the Iloilo Customs House, erected by the Americans in 1916 as commemorated by its building seal. In 1900, the annual customs collection of the port did not go over ₱1 million, but by 1934, it reached over 2.2 million pesos. This newfound prosperity is evident in the commanding presence of the Customs House, which also lodged the Office of Postal Services. Across the landmark, just off Calle Real, were two of the most popular cinemas in the city, the Palace and Eagle Theaters, which introduced the city to Hollywood. The port opening stimulated the commercialization of agriculture in and around Iloilo province. It also brought about the long-awaited improvements in port facilities, expanding the waterfront, connecting it with the business center, and dredging the silted river. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the Muelle became the node for local and international trade. And this transformation prior to the Commonwealth era gave Iloilo a distinct identity as a port city on which the Americans built their contributions to its urban form. Iloilo's 19th century transformation into an international hub is credited chiefly to the British trader Nicholas Loney. And in 1904, the Iloilo Municipal Council named the road tracing the southern riverbank after him. Loney was the first non-Spanish Westerner to reside in Iloilo, arriving well before the opening of its port to international trade. Working part-time as the British Vice Consul, he enjoyed the privilege to trade at the premises of Kerr and Company. It was he who first recognized the potential of sugar as an export product, filling the ships entering and leaving Iloilo Harbor. Loni instigated the development of del Progreso, now De la Rama Street, that linked the Muelle to the city center. This was the main street for foreign merchant enterprises with banks, consular offices, insurance firms, etc. The Americans later expanded this and the road to the Muelle and the road of the Muelle, as well as reinforced the wharf with concrete. New breakwaters and piers and dry docks were built, expanding and internally improving the seaport. Waterfront expansion improved passenger access to the harbor. It also facilitated the movement of cargo for the ships as well as for the railway line on the riverbank. Photographs failed to capture the harbor's noise and activity, bolstered by the free trade agreement between the Philippines and the United States. The warehouses established at the Muelle Loni testify to the urban transformations there. Modernizing the port facilities eased the density of crowds and transport in what was once the Muelle's narrow confines. Port development, including the construction of the massive Guimaras Strait Wharf, relieved the heavy vessel and passenger traffic that the sugar trade created through the years of the First World War and the decades that followed. New roads linked the port to other nodes nearby and to other parts of the province. Because the soft grade of gravel available in Iloilo was unsuitable and costly for surfacing the streets, the Bureau of Public Works recommended the opening of a stone quarry on Guimaras Island across the Iloilo Strait. The increased port activity prompted temporary accommodations right at the riverfront. Other hotels were set up or refurbished around the nearby Plaza district. From its mouth and into the Muelle, and then across the floodplains inland, the Iloilo River rises and falls with the tides. Technically, it is an estuary with no defined headwater or watershed. The overall landscape shown here comes from the long progress of dredging the harbor, reclaiming the swampland, and creating ways to regulate floods. Today, the Iloilo Esplanade started as a flood control project, but this linear park has expanded into a terrific example of urban regeneration. It showcases the rehabilitation of the RIA for future generations. Kudos to Paulo Alcazaren here for helping Iloilo make the Esplanade and other related projects happen. Southwest of the river mouth is the old landmark facing the sea, the fort or fuerza. Until the early 20th century, because of its sheer size, it was the prominent reference point that identified the area of Iloilo City. Like the city itself, this landmark also had many names: Fuerza de Iloilo, de la Provincia de Oton, La Fortaleza de Iloilo, La Cota, and later as the Iloilo Fort or Fort San Pedro, or simply the fort. Fortifications in Spanish-era Philippines were defenses against colonial rivals in Asia and against Muslim pirates. By the 18th century, after withstanding repeated assaults, Iloilo's barricades from the 1600s turned into this massive structure. The Spanish regime used part of the fort as a prison for Moro pirates. After the start of the Philippine-American War in Manila, and after laying siege to Iloilo, the Americans took over the fort. They also used it as a prison until the provincial jail was opened in 1911. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt declared Fort San Pedro and its adjoining areas a military reservation. Built on reclaimed land, the site covered 34.5 hectares and it came to accommodate the forestry and land bureaus as well as the offices of Iloilo's district engineer and provincial treasurer. An airport was eventually built near the fort, near its northern side. In 1932, the Iloilo Negros Air Express Company, or INAEC, launched its first flight from this airport. INAEC was Asia's first commercial airline. In 1936, as the clouds of war with Japan loomed, the Commonwealth's National Defense Act altered the fort and its environs again. President Manuel Alcazaren designated the entire military reservation as a Philippine Army post. In 1941, this Japanese propaganda postcard claims that the Umiwashi or Ocean Eagle plane hit the Iloilo airport on December 18 of that year. What the photo captures, in fact, is the destruction of the Philippine National Railway facility in Lapus. On the Iloilo side, the Inaek hangar was also bombed that same day. When Japanese forces occupied the city on April 16, 1942, they seized control of Fort San Pedro and made it their headquarters. But Panay was not easily pacified by the Japanese. In February 1943, Panay guerrillas ambushed General Seiichi Tanaka. This attack on the supreme commander of the Japanese Imperial Army in the Philippines was a unique occurrence. Punitive Japanese campaigns soon followed the ambush. Ferocious guerrilla counterattacks, bolstered by American arms and supply deliveries, shattered any illusion of normalcy. The Panay guerrillas had fully cordoned Iloilo City in March 1945. On the morning of March 18, the Americans landed in Tigbawan. But even with their reinforcements, the Japanese managed to withdraw from the city that same evening. On March 20th, the guerrillas paraded as victors along Calle Real, reaching the customs house. There, Major General Rapbrush, head of the 40th Battalion, Infantry Division, addressed soldiers and civilians alike, a crowd exuberant even if the Japanese had not yet surrendered and the war not yet ended. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Doc Meloy.
Thank you.
Pre-pandemic, FHL unveiled Women in War, an exhibition on women workers, warriors, and survivors of World War II at the Henry Luce III Library of CPU in Iloilo. We look forward to going back and seeing the city through your lens. Our last speaker, Dr. Felice Noelle Rodriguez, is a visiting scholar at the Ateneo de Zamboanga University. She published works on warfare, the early Christian missions, nationalism, and urbanization. She has curated exhibits tracing diverse historical concerns, La Solidaridad, Philippine postcards, and the history of Zamboanga. She continues her research on raiding and trade and is currently working on a visual history of Zamboanga with Mike Price. Doc Noel, you may now proceed. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Um, Thank you to the organizers for inviting, and thank you to all as well for joining me in this journey in making sense of my hometown city, Zamboanga, beautiful. Today, Zamboanga advertises itself as the Latin city of Asia, owing to its unique Chabacano language, once denounced as bastardized Spanish, but its history speaks of a melting pot for various communities. From the late Spanish colonial period, the township Chabacano culture changed with new immigrations. It further mutated to become a planned American colonial city in the early 20th century. In the southwestern part of Mindanao, a peninsula juts out. On its tip is the city of Zamboanga. Geographically strategic in stopping slave raids to the Visayas and other settlements, the Spanish made it a base, building a fort of stone in 1635, abandoned 1663, then rebuilt in 1719. It is from here on that a settlement grows with a diverse demography made up of its original inhabitants, including the Lutao or Samabajao by the coastal areas and the Sibanan along rivers. Also, relocated Visayan families, redeemed or escaped slaves who looked to the fort for refuge or protection, captives from Spanish 19th century attacks on Samal Balangini strongholds, Chinese and other foreign traders, and the Spanish garrison of possibly Visayan or Kapampangan soldiers make up the small settlement with a church built to cater to the community. And further west, in Magay and Kawakawa area, were the homes on stilts of the Bajaus. In the middle of the 19th century, in the twilight of Spanish colonialism in Mindanao, Spain was just beginning to have a stronger foothold. With the introduction of steamboats, they attacked and destroyed a number of raiding communities and held treaties with the Sultan of Sulu. Also, only in the late 19th century did the Jesuit missionaries return to Zamboanga and set up further communities using the royal law of the Indies, where people began to live according to Catholic and Spanish colonial ways of life. Examples would be Tetuan, Santa Maria, Las Mercedes, and all the way northwest to Ayala. By then, Zamboanga had grown to a multi-ethnic community that developed a Spanish Creole language, a language of its own. In this Spanish document, it is called Castellano Degenerado, derogatorily translated as bastardized Spanish. But as you can see, Zamboanga then was made up of naturales, moros, chinos, mestizos, españoles, y europeos, and spoke varied languages. But number one language that was used was Castellano Degenerado. Just before the Americans arrived, Zamboanga was almost entirely razed by fire. The retreating Spaniards' last stand was in Zamboanga. Vicente Alvarez set up a short-lived Zamboanga Republic. There was fighting as well between two factions. In 1899, the feuding factions eased the American takeover of Zamboanga. The Americans occupied Fort Pilar and what used to be the Spanish headquarters. The military presence of tents was followed by renovations of Spanish buildings. Houses mostly made of nipa, some of stone and plaster were also rebuilt in the early years along Magay, Kawakawa, now called Justice R.T. Lim Boulevard, but houses there on stilts remained. A combination of American colonial governance and economic expansion reforms saw the rapid growth of Zamboanga. In terms of American colonial governance, Mindanao was governed separately from the Philippines with the creation first of the Moro province from 1903 to 1913, and later the Department of Mindanao and Sulu from 1914 to 1920. Throughout, Zamboanga remained the capital, the political, social, educational center of the region, and more importantly, the economic center as well. In terms of economic expansion, Mindanao was looked as a place with rich natural resources waiting to be harnessed. A glance at the map, this was published in 1906, and a quote from the article where this map came from says that this map will give the reader some idea of the importance of Zamboanga, the capital of the Moro province, as a future trade center. It stands today without rival as a coming center of trade of the Far East. Even before the establishment of the Moro province, a number of businesses began to be set up, and eventually more businesses came in, showing a growing mix of people from different parts of the world, like Quenzel and Strife, for example, and John Spirig, who were actually Swiss Americans, like the Williamson brothers, Redding and Company, who used to be US volunteers and moved to Zamboanga, and they were cutters and shippers of timber. And they supplied, for example, Molave for the flooring of the present City Hall, what was then the provincial building, as well as the wood timber for the building of the Manila Railways. Chinese settlements were also in existence, and for example, Francisco Barrios, known then as the richest man in Zamboanga, who even advanced 10,000 US dollars to the US Army for their salaries. And there were also other Chinese businessmen, as noted here in a 1906 Far Eastern Review article. The Bank of the Philippine Islands, building also owned by Barrios then, still exists until today and currently runs in the same exact place and with the second floor as a museum. Compañía Maritima in this building was had as its advertisement the new Mindanao as the new Mindanao service puts Zamboanga next door to all the world. You also had other businesses like Mr. Wilson's ice making machinery that provided ice not only for private residences and hotels, but also for the ships that started to come to dock in the Zamboanga waters. There were also abaca plantations, and here in these photographs with Japanese workmen, and as well as coconut plantations, especially during World War I, with the demand for copra due to its glycerin content for munitions. And interestingly, there was even a turtle ranch as published in a 1906 article. Now, the published 1906 urban plan for Zamboanga. So this was all followed by American colonial urban planning. William Parson, who was a consulting architect to the Philippine Commission, provided this plan, which was approved by the Legislative Council of the Moro Province. All future works of the municipality was to conform to this plan. Though the plan to have wide avenues lined with trees leading north to Pulumbato or Pasunanga did not materialize, there were other aspects that were adopted. So here we see a transformation, building materials, technological advancements, which would reflect growth and dynamism, which would be used in Zamboanga. So this was to be a design for the new colony. The development of the infrastructure would be organized for commercial interests, for the exploitation of natural resources, and the need for making Zamboanga a home away from home for all the troops and for missionaries who started to come in, teachers, traders, even bartenders, and some who brought their families with them. But for local communities as well, this was what we call a civilizing way, and the move, especially in terms of urban morphology, to make Zamboanga, the move from the fort and the church as its center to the provincial building. From here, I speak of buildings in terms of infrastructure. I shall speak about buildings, the wharf, and the shared space. In this map, a 1917 tourist guide map published in Japan, we look at now the move from Fort Pilar, from the fort, which used to be the center, and the church, to what was then called the provincial building. The provincial building started to be built 1905 and was completed only in 1907, was to become the heart of the city from which arteries of communication radiate. It was to be the center of power. The style was a combination of Spanish Renaissance with local style of architecture, like the use of capiz shells for windows. But note the introduction of concrete blocks, and these concrete blocks were actually made according to a 1909 report by quote-unquote native Moro prisoners. These concrete blocks were used for permanency. At the same time, wood like molave was used for flooring, and QB hardwood, which was fire resistant. So these photos were taken last month by Glenn Solis during the pandemic. That's why we see it empty, but Usually it is filled with people from by Zamboangueños, as it is now the City Hall. Along Calle Voluntarios, now called Don Pablo Lorenzo Street, we see a number of buildings of concrete with neoclassical design with columns that started to be built, buildings, and would change the urban landscape of the city. So around it, for example, in this letter by Miss Canizares, by Rosa to Miss Canizares, she talks about this building of barrios, and she says below it is the American pharmacy, as he states, looked here. And we see more samples of buildings that were built, like that by Mr. Moore and Senor Murga. And also in 1916, a Broad building was built. To your right is Mr. Broad, and famous was the American Bazaar that was housed in it. Also, City Hall in 1922, which Rosa would write as having an artistic garden. And interestingly, Zamboanga would be called City 1911, but it was later reverted back to a municipio, and only later in 1937 would it become a city chartered. And a municipal market as well of steel with concrete flooring has been ordered. This was for cleanliness, and Zamboanga then had the best fish market. You know, those turtles I showed earlier would be a natural scene in the markets, and fishes of different kinds as well. Zamboanga Normal School was also built, and it was to be the best. And just to show you how Zamboanga would be the center for not only in terms of government, in terms of social, but as well as in terms of education. So the Zamboanga Normal School was built, and people from around the region, especially Mindanao, would come. And here we have a photo of a group of Sulu teachers at the Normal Institute in Zamboanga in 1915. To your upper right in that red dot would be built the Zamboanga General Hospital, 1918. And again, for the entire Mindanao, it was like the center for and open to everyone. And not only was it a hospital, but actually in this publication in 1924, Abdul Atip Rasul, the nephew of then Senator Haji Butu, was the first Moro graduate in nursing in 1924. Aside from buildings, the wharfs and the streets were also modified to bring in commerce. So the wharf during the Spanish period was mostly made up of hardwood, and it would later be rebuilt using sand and coral fill, and much later developed with concrete. And iconic to Zamboanga, making it quote unquote city beautiful, are these concrete bougainvillea vases that you would see all around Zamboanga. So first here in the wharf, and also lights were installed with electricity. In terms of roads, in 1907, a report, Governor General's report, says that a large amount of street work had been done involving curbs, a small amount of sidewalk, and also metaling of the streets. But this would be like a continuous effort of making sure there would be, that roads would be maintained. And this was in the barracks, what later would be called the Petit Barracks, but the post. And Here, it would be lined with talisay trees, and at night, it is home to hundreds of flying foxes coming in from Santa Cruz Islands. It doesn't occur anymore, and I wonder what happened to all these flying foxes. Anyway, Felipe II, now Guardia Nacional, was the most lively of business streets, as mentioned here in the letter of Rosa, again to Soling in 1916. Bridges would also be built and modified, first using hardwood and later on steel. Transportation would be used. Here you had, of course, many different types of transportation, but interestingly, Patrick Henry Frank started a bus line and opened a Zamboanga Transport Company. The town's first automobile actually came in 1908. Here, up in American Bazaar, just wanted to point out as well the I call the bougainvillea vases or the lotus vases, which would be seen all around Zamboanga at that time. Private cars were also used. To the left is Jean McLaren, a nurse, and she's there in Brent Hospital. This was photo given to me by her nephew, Ian Hay. And here is my grandparents, also Dr. Rodriguez from the Philippine General Hospital, just to show you that at this time, roads and transportation was built. Public space. William Parson also made room for public parks for recreation and amusement. He looked at the sunken garden and the ground surrounding Fort Pilar, and he stressed the need for the planting of trees for shade. There was even a nursery for plants to beautify the place. And we look now at public space, and we look first at the Rizal Monument. In 1921, I think one of the most beautiful monuments of Rizal, and it was built from the funds from the public. This wasn't a government monument, but rather it came from ordinary people. And it was used as space where people gathered, as shown here in 1938 for the 4th of July celebration. And today, it still stands this way. Of course, this was taken during the pandemic as well. So you see the stores around it closed, and there aren't people milling around, but usually it's filled with people. So this is also Plaza Pershing, the Rizal Monument. And then you have the Plaza Rizal, and also built and was the Plaza Pershing right in front of the church. And it was it was beautified. First, it looked like this with just the bandstand for people to mill around. But eventually in 1915, Thomas Hanley came in to rebuild the place. And here it says that in a postcard that it is actually one of the most beautiful gardens of the archipelago. Here you will see concrete roof, concrete arches, pillars, and it was also used as for events for schools, like here Ateneo de Zamboanga, and even for other big events. The last of these shared spaces is the Petit Barracks, which were like the parade grounds. It is for the first time in Zamboanga during the American period that peoples from different parts of Mindanao came together. For example, 1903, Governor Finley held at Zamboanga what he called bichara, or a meeting. We don't have photos of that time, but from his description, here I show photos of the visit 1905 of William Howard Taft. And from the photographs of that time, of that visit, we see how people from different groups. So according to Finley, this is 1903, but the same in 1905. He says 4,000 of these people arrived by trail and by a vast number of native boats, the latter being highly decorated with bunting. Their approach was heralded by the beating of agongs and kulintangans and the firing of lantakas. As this vast assemblage drew near to the Zamboanga dock, the hum of voices, the shouts of command, the swish of paddles, all coupled with the noise of agongs and lantakas, made indescribable splendor. So you have people also from the Manobos, the Bagobos, who were in Zamboanga. So this was in 1905 with William Taft, and it will be repeated again and again. For example, in other fairs, in other carnivals. So in 1907, you had the first carnival exposition ever held in the Philippine Islands that went on for 5 days, where thousands of people from different parts of the Philippines, and especially from different parts of Mindanao, coming together, and not only in presenting their wares, and but also in encounters in terms of games, in terms of presentations, dances. So here in 1923 Carnival and Industrial Exposition, it would mention that in the end, there actually was a dance, that all these would eventually end with a dance. And here, Rosie Shin, 1930 Petit Carnival, and it would always be projected as "Come see Zamboanga, the city beautiful of the Philippines." Now, in this map, further north, in red is the river that leads up to Pulumbato, Pasunangka. This would also be developed by Thomas Handley, and for recreation for all, like a swimming pool and gardens, and it would always be a place to go to during these carnivals, during these fairs. And in all these encounters, one can just imagine the outcome, of Maranao and a Manobo and a Zamboangueño and a Visayan, all coming together in all sorts of games. For example, you had sack race, you had even a goat race, you had the rickshaw race, and also performances. So here, for the first time, we would see encounters, and so with that, a development of sense of belonging to this place, of connectedness to one to the other. So here, for example, people from the Visayas for the Philippine Medical Association coming and visiting Pasunangka. Today, Fort Pilar, which was like the bastion of Spanish colonial rule, eventually becomes a museum today. But aside from that, not part of the Spanish plan, not part of the American plan, would be Fort Pilar, the Nuestra Senora del Pilar, which is like an icon of Zamboanga, where people would come to gather as a sacred space. So at the same time, with the language, people would come together from varied communities and speak. So like a Chinese in this book by Cesar Lee would say they spoke in Chinese, in Chavacano. Book by Helen Mendoza, she would also speak Chavacano. And even in letters of Americans, when they would ride a Karomata or a Kalesa or a rickshaw, they would speak to the quote-unquote, what they say, Moro puller of the rickshaw in Chabacano. So here we see a building of a culture of people coming together, very varied demography. Today, we see this also along Kawakawa Boulevard, which used to be like part of where houses of stilts used to be. The community that was here was put in a different local place. But in all this, there has been change, and yet it has remained the same. So here I try to show you 2021 going back to 1906. From today, we go back to the past and see that the basic arterial structure of Zamboanga's main thoroughfares, defined by the roads of downtown Zamboanga, remain unchanged from the late Spanish period to the present. But its built environment grew rapidly during the American period, the first 4 decades of the 20th century. Thus, the Spanish garrison settlement of the 17th century has morphed to become an American colonial, but nonetheless, Chabacano city. Thank you. Thank you to all as well who has contributed to the photographs and to the making of this presentation. Thank you.
Again, a very, very insightful talk coming from Doc Noel. Thank you. I'm thrilled to see the BPI building in your slides. FHL actually facilitated one of our Erencia lectures there. It was an introductory course on Philippine art to teachers. Did you know that herencia in Spanish is actually inheritance or legacy? It alludes not only to a rich past, but also to a promising future. Speaking of moving forward, may I now call Architect Paulo Alcazaren, Doc Meloy Mabunay, and Doc Noel to join us in the next part of the program, the Q&A session. Let's keep the ball rolling. The first question we got from Oli Lucas. He says, or he asks, how do we shape cities that are child friendly? What efforts are there to consult children on what they see as needed in their neighborhoods? Architect Paulo can answer this question.
Well, children were schooled in civics in the era before the war, and there was the subject called civics, which today I believe is Hekasi. But in those days, the textbooks would clearly outline uh, the importance of planning and maintaining towns and cities, physical planning, actual physical planning, as well as the importance of monuments and heritage. Unfortunately, our education today is lacking in all of these aspects of education. Now, as to participation, there are initiatives by various LGUs to bring in the youth and children into the process, but this is few and far between. These are usually done in venues called charrettes, where the planning office or the planners, consulting planners, would bring together the stakeholders, including children, into the process. But a lot of the charrettes with children are usually for parks and recreational design and recreational places like playgrounds. This is where, of course, children can participate. But it all starts from education. Thank you.
Do you have something to add? Thank you for that, Sir Pao. Um, Doc Meloy, do you have something to add regarding that question, or Doc Noel?
I don't think I can answer that at the moment.
Okay. Doc Noel, you want something to add to that? I think specifically for Zamboanga, are there efforts to make the city more child friendly in a way?
I don't know about policies that were put up with regards to really making it child friendly, but from my experience, I do know that there have been like I didn't touch on, for example, the northern part where you have Pasunangka Park and how that is being developed by the city. And only currently, with photos being sent by my friends and classmates from Zamboanga, did they show me actually that last slide along Kawakawa Boulevard that was further developed. So land is being reclaimed as well. So being child friendly, I'm not sure of the policies. I think
Mhm.
um,
I see.
Paulo would know more about that.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
if I may, I forgot to mention, Sonia, that making the actual making of towns and cities child friendly will come from making pedestrian mobility and access available to all. So that's wide sidewalks unencumbered by poles or kiosks or anything else, and also ensuring that parks and open spaces are within 15 minutes walk of any place. Also, street crossings can be made more child PWD and elderly friendly, as we've done in Makati CBD through the Urban Patios program. So these are the ways that you can make a city child friendly. And if you want to read up on the essentials of this, you just go to the classic work of Jane Jacobs, the uh, Death and Life of Great American Cities, espouses for child and people friendly, human centered design rather than a vehicle or profit oriented approach to urban planning.
Thank you for that. Now the next question is for Doc Meloy. This
Yes.
question is from Ruchi Pototanon.
Oh, okay.
He asks, you mentioned the persistence of Webesan market in Haro. Is this a manifestation of resistance towards the idea that Iloilo is just one city? The districts of Iloilo prior to American colonial period are independent pueblos until they were integrated into becoming one municipality in 1903, question mark. Do you think that this fragmented past, quote unquote, affects the historical imagination of the city?
Thank you, Richie Mark, for that question. But I would just like to remind you that prior to the formation of the city in 1936, Haro was much more a populous, productive, and prosperous settlement than Iloilo ever was. Without the port, Iloilo was nothing. It was a backwater in comparison to Haro, which was the diocesan center and the center of that weekly market trade with Pototan in the inland area as another main weekly market node. So that if you say that it's a resistance, I would not say that it was an active resistance, but that it was a given already when it became part of the city. So that the city actually benefited from its persistence. Until today, many people do frequent the Huebesan in Haro. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Now, next question for Doc Noel. What is the reason why they transferred the settlement of Bajaus from Kawakawa and Magay to Campo Islam during the American period?
Well, actually, I don't know the real reason, but it was uh, possibly to widen the area because they wanted to reclaim land as well. So I don't exactly know the real reason for that. I just know that they did. Yeah. Though there were other communities that remained. So that area along Kawakawa, yes, they were um, resettled. I don't know the reason, the exact reason behind that or the policy.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Doc Noel, for shedding a bit of perspective regarding that, even if the exact reason is not present, but I at least we have a better idea why. Now the next question is for Sir Paulo. Why were the previous master plans for Manila and Quezon City not fully implemented?
Uh, we ran out of money. The money was lost to graft and corruption, and then there was lack of political will. Although in present day Manila, it's actually not a lack of political will. It's the fact that there are 17 political wills. So the reason Makati worked is that it was driven very strongly by a single entity, which was a private corporation, but working in collaboration with a local government unit. So it's easier to do. You cannot compare Makati to the rest of Metro Manila because it's easier to do under a corporate, which brings up the whole bunch of issues on giving city building responsibilities to private corporations. But there is a middle ground that can be sought, especially now because the financial wherewithal to actually build cities lies in corporations that actually control the banking system, and that's a whole different issue there. So good corporate responsibility is essential, and we're all in this together as shown by the pandemic. So we have to put everything in context and ensure that we can move forward based on what resources we have. So we have to change the paradigm of urban and in fact national development and filter that down to the cities where now 6 out of 10 Filipinos live. It's very complex, but we have to do it.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Sir Pao. Now, this question is for everyone. This question is for everyone, and it concerns all the three cities that were discussed today. And this question is from Kenneth Gonzalez. He asks, if the planned city beautiful developments of the three cities discussed were religiously followed, do you feel it will still be significant at the present context? What do you think were the things overlooked by planners and historians and citizens back then that will need to be addressed at the present? We can start in reverse. Let's start from Doc Noel, then Doc Meloy, then Sir Paulo.
Sorry, can we start with Doc Meloy first?
Okay, Doc.
Or
Okay,
sorry.
okay. Doc Meloy, do you wanna
Well,
answer the question?
I'll attempt to answer that by saying that I don't know for
Mhm.
certain if any of the new developments by whichever developer, private or public, had actually taken in mind the Arellano plan. Because
Yeah.
I think nobody has really studied it. And that, in my view, what is happening now is the northwestern sector that I referred to in the presentation, which was the main area of Arellano's plan, is actually now being developed by the private sector. So that they are actually, whether conscious or not, they are making a nod to Arellano's plan. So whether it's Mega World or Gaisano or of course the Ayalas are there too, they are actually working at it. But I might add that maybe a bit of hindsight, we can say that the development of the port of Iloilo, for that matter, was the initial private public partnership perhaps of the foreign merchants, particularly Loni, with the Spanish authorities to develop the initial improvements on the port. So that has happened. Even foreigners contributed there. Here we have the business sector also working with the local government, perhaps, and take a look at the Arellano plan. Maybe they are actually working on it. That's all I can say. I don't know if they are aware.
Uh, Thoughts, Sir Pao?
Yes, the subject of City Beautiful, which is a movement started in in the United States in the late 19th century, and coupled with the Garden City movement by Ebenezer Howard, was taken uh, as the template for a lot of development at the turn of the century into the early 1910s. But you cannot apply it to cities today. The city beautiful plans of the three cities we discussed are based on populations that were much smaller than today. Manila was
Exactly.
250,000. Today it's 25 million for the NCR. So the factor that has changed and which would make the original plans not work is the fact that the population has increased and the conditions are different. Having said that, the City Beautiful plan of Manila versus Quezon City was superior in that when we got to Quezon City, it was City Beautiful enlarged and based on the assumption that everybody would use cars rather than the original Burnham
Mm.
plan, because Burnham did his in '04 when cars were not yet the prevalent mode of transportation, and rail-based mass transport systems were still in primary use. So Burnham has been much maligned, but a lot of his City Beautiful plans were in fact very smart cities, very good density cities, where things were accessible and fairly equal distribution across, say, the plan of Chicago and San Francisco that he did. There are lessons to be learned from City Beautiful, but and there are movements today like the new urbanism movement, which is based on some of the aspects of City Beautiful and Garden City. The answer is that for us to find a proper urban framework, we have to study the past, learn for the lessons from the past, understand the present, and apply research to develop new knowledge base. And what is lacking in academe in the Philippines for both the social urban sociologists as well as the physical designers is this body of knowledge that we have not yet embarked on. Starting from a study of what we have inherited from the past and learning what works, what doesn't work.
Mm.
And much of the lessons, unfortunately, are learned mostly by private corporations applied to very limited parameters of the properties they own. So it's essential that we question everything and learn these lessons both from the past as well as using science and data that we can get now very much better aided by computers and algorithms and such. So data-driven design based on lessons intellectually understood is the way forward, such as fora that you have just organized.
Thank you for that, Sir Paulo. Now, the next question is specifically for Doc Noel. This question is from Joshua Vargas. He says, "Hello, thank you for the insightful presentation. This is for Doc Noel. He asks, I remember a text I read in class about the political and nation building motivations behind the Parsons Plan for Zamboanga. Where would be a good place to start reading for learning more about the imperial or political aspect of early 1900s planning? Would the motivation behind planning cities and exerting power in Mindanao have anything to do with the American perception of the Malay world?"
Okay, with regards to uh, materials on the civilizing uh, uh, policies that were set up and the plans. So William Parson actually published his, well, there was a publication on the plan itself of William Parson, very detailed with where the wharves will be, what, where the city would be, what, even the types of plants that to be put in, and why. It was more to make, as shown in the 1906 map that I presented, it was really to make it like the center, for entire Mindanao. So the thinking was really that Zamboanga, Mindanao was separate, well, at that time from the Philippines. and with especially with this with Zamboanga and Mindanao with the natural resources and exploiting the natural resources. And um, originally it was, for the troops. You have so many soldiers, missionaries, teachers coming into Zamboanga, and of course it was like the base. And so you have to use it as a place where the soldier would feel at home. So it was like a home away from home. So you even have their families coming there later and being part of the community. Now, as with the concept of making it part of the Malay world, I don't know if that came into being, but uh, or if that was even in their mindset. But actually, it was more for commerce, and so shipping lines, for example, Sime Darby, which was nearby, would come to Zamboanga, so Sandakan and other areas which were closer to Mindanao would link up with Zamboanga, but this was all for commercial purposes. You know, there have been new books that just came out. Actually, was it last year? On Mindanao, treating on this. So, for example, Ian Morley came out with two
Yes.
books on it, and then you have Oliver Charbonneau on civilizational imperatives. And there have been others, and you can read up on, for example, works of Jojo Abinales with regards to Mindanao. I mean, there's so much material coming out. But what's interesting is also to look back at sources of that time, and this is a time to look at Filipinas Heritage Library. And for those wanting to look at sources, the sources are there. You have the Mindanao Herald, you have other newspapers that came out at that time. You have you have the best collection, for example, of photographs because of Orenda Inn's book on Zamboanga. So the material, and which was published by Ayala Foundation. So you have the materials there, and you can look up Filipinas Heritage Library in terms of sources.
Yeah, if I may, Sophia, I agree with Noel. Ian Marley's two books have been the
Mm.
latest produced on colonial planning, but you could also access the works of Mindanaoan Davaoenyo Dakudao, as
Michael
well
Kuda.
as Michael Dakudao, as well as uh, uh, Professor Lico from the University of the Philippines, and Edson Cabalfin also from that university. But the interesting works in terms of the genesis of colonial cities is by geographer Robert Reed, as well
Mm.
as if you go into the other sciences, social sciences, Vicente Rafael, in terms of colonialism. So these are the key authors, and as I agree, the primary sources are with our libraries and our archives, although it's our archive national archives are a mess right now. But
Very difficult.
yes, it's very difficult, and academia in the Philippines is sorely unfunded. Very difficult to get funds. That's why I left academia. I don't teach anymore because it's very difficult to get grants, and unless we do that, then we can't push forward. Thank you.
Thank you for answering the questions, Doc Noel and Sir Paulo, and adding to the resources. I'm pretty sure our attendees loved to hear those suggestions. Now, well, by the way, to our audience, we might extend for 10 minutes because your questions keep on coming.
Yeah, a
So we
lot
have
of
room for
questions.
we have room for three more. This question is again for everyone. What and this question is coming from Jennifer De Reyes. She asks, "What do you think about the push and pull between heritage buildings or sites in the modern metropolis?" Um, anyone can start. Doc Meloy, do you want to start again?
I am not very familiar with other places, but what I
It's
know is that in Iloilo, there is actually some tension right now between the advocates of heritage conservation and those who want new development very close to the heritage sites. So, but I have to dig up because that has not been the focus of my research. So, I hesitate to contribute to something that I have not really fully investigated.
okay. Thank you. How about Sir Paulo? Do you have any thoughts
Yes,
regarding that
I'll
question?
speak to that. Heritage conservation. I'm a founding member of the Heritage Conservation Society, and there is a law now, RA 166, for conservation of heritage buildings and sites, and of course the NCCA is involved and the NHCP. But the push and pull from urban development is such that the knee jerk would be to demolish all of these things and replace them with 40-story buildings. The success of any city is the fact that you have a diverse fabric of old and new buildings. And by the way, the greenest building is one that's already built. But the
Mhm.
problem is the scale of the new development, say a 40-story building versus a 6-story building. And if you do the math just from a purely corporate agenda, you will go for the profit. They don't look at all of the other formulas for embedded energy and such and heritage. And this is where planning can help. RA 166 is a great law, but the IRR is lacking in teeth. And the other thing that's lacking within dense urban cores like Manila, Iloilo, Baguio is the lack of the principle of development transfer rights. That means if you have a 6-story building that's a heritage building, in other progressive countries and cities, they assign a value to the airspace above you. So there is less incentive for you to sell to a developer who wants to put a 40-story building because you can trade that airspace with this developer, assuming there's another area within the metropolis that is the receiving area for this transfer rights. And in that area, and this is a little complicated, you have to control densities and floor area ratios. So for developers who want to build, say, past a cap of 20 or 30 stories, they buy the value from the transfer rights that the owners of the old buildings have. It's the only way that this can work. But it's not just that. There are other things. You have disincentives, just like Iloilo and Bigan. Incentives and disincentives, the establishment of zones of conservation, which is easier to handle rather than single structures. It's easier to conserve full districts rather than single buildings. That's why we're losing the Phil. That's why we lost the High Alai. But if it's groups buildings like in Bigan or Iloilo's central core, then you can establish, as Iloilo and Bigan has, conservation districts. Now, these districts can be defined. The incentives for the owners in them can be passed through ordinances in the cities. In Iloilo case, the ICC-HCC. In Bigan, a similar way they did that. But the issues nowadays is at the fringes of those urban cores. Then you have the 30 or 40-story buildings. So it has to be a continuing dialogue with what the city wants, what owners and developers want, and in the larger context of the overall development, we have to have a balance of heritage, the old and the new, much like the lesson of Singapore in the 80s when they found out that the tourism number was going down. The government say, what's the reason why our numbers are going down? Because tourism was bringing a lot of income to Singapore. They found that they were bulldozing all of the old buildings. So tourists were not coming because there was no authentic Singapore anymore. So what the government did was to flip, do a 180, and then they conserved areas. Of course, that's Singapore. cannot apply it to everywhere else. But it's a cocktail of measures that can ensure that the push and pull are balanced. And what we don't want is to end up with cities that look the same everywhere you go. You walk into a downtown and it looks like downtown New York or even downtown Hong Kong. There is no specificity from the original old fabric that was a result of 100, 200 years of the history of that place to give you a sense of place and a sense of belonging or even a sense of pride. So those are the issues we have to think about.
Yeah. Ang dami. Ang dami nun. It was a lot. It was a lot. The next question will be addressed to Doc Meloy and Sir Paulo as well. And this is coming from Denson Villegas. He asks, is there an argument for deurbanization as a civic good in the sense of opening public spaces back up? This is, of course, aside from the environmental concerns of heavily populated concrete jungles causing land subsidence which city dwellers experience as endemic flooding. So, for
Mm.
both cities, for Iloilo and maybe Manila, Doc Melo, you can start.
I am not an urban planner. I am a
It's okay.
historian. So
Yeah.
let me pass the ball to Paulo, please.
Paulo, okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, deurbanization. It's really not deurbanization, but actually better planning and greening. And
Mm.
there is such a thing as good density versus bad density. In Metro Manila, we have bad density in that we don't put people together in rational building complexes with any thought to mobility. So
Mm.
in parts of in large parts of Hong Kong and Singapore, you have concentration of people much larger than even our informal settlers. But they are housed in housing estates that are provided with all of the infrastructure that
Facilities.
makes urban life bearable and actually comfortable. That means that you are in high rise, high density residential areas, affordable by almost everyone. You are only 5 to 10 minutes away from a park or open space. You are serviced by public mass transport system that ensures that you get to anywhere within Hong Kong or Singapore within 30 minutes without having to ride a car. These are very basic, yet we have not learned those lessons. And it's really not the urbanization, but green urbanization, which is what the fancy word today is biophilic design. Like the image in the background of mine, it's within a dense area of Makati, but it's accessible by walking. And we've ensured that you can walk to this from the whole of Salcedo and even Legazpi villages. So this is smart green urbanism, which can mitigate the effects of density. And because we are such a dense country, because we have not addressed population management being Catholic, then we have to live with the fact that we have to find solutions for good density rather than bad density. Otherwise, we have to tackle the aspect of population management. So these are all factors. Unless we question what we've done and why things
Why?
are the way they are, then we will not find any solutions. And the solutions come from ourselves. The knight in shining armor cannot be from overseas. There is no foreign consultant that can tell us the solution to our problems because they are our problems and we must find our solution to them. Otherwise, it's not sustainable.
That's our last question. We exceeded for 10 minutes. Yes, we totally agree. The solution should really come from ourselves since these are our problems. So thank you, Architect Paulo, Doc Meloy, Doc Noel, for the interesting presentations and your answers, the discussion in our second part, the Q&A session. And of course, we thank those of you who sent in questions via Facebook live stream or here in our Zoom room, and for everyone who joined us today. Any final words before we cap off and do the final announcements? You, Doc Meloy, Doc Noel, or Paulo?
On my part, I'd like to be able to thank my sources of information and materials. There are too many to name, though, and they know who they are. Thank you very much.
Doc Noel,
Yes, I think this is really a long journey, of going back to uh, Parsons' City Beautiful plan. But the more I look at it, I think there's really a desire to hopefully look back, at these plans, especially for the city of Zamboanga, especially now when we have, I mean, for Zamboangueños now, we always have brownouts and so these are things when then it was their electricity was there, water is free, and it was known to be the most beautiful city, actually, the entire Philippines. And you could read that in all the letters, the postcards, and at times I wonder what happened. So of course there are aspects of it that are there, and culture is always, as I said, you have the demography is always so like diverse, and Zamboanga is so vibrant, and it's the people that make it like so alive, and the language, the culture, and there's always the pride of being, hey, I'm from there. But I think it's time to take up responsibility also and speak up and say, I belong to this place. What do I do now? Why don't we get together and do something about it? So it's still a dream, and I hope people here and people from Zamboanga can join me in making Zamboanga, the city beautiful that it once was. Thank you.
Yeah, Sophia, I just have three things. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for such a wonderful event and congratulate the other speakers for their very interesting talks. Second, and the lesson learned from our neighbors, and this is where we have to look for is our neighbors of similar cultures and similar climes. I used to travel to Hong Kong, Singapore, and Kuala Lumpur starting from over 30 years ago, and they were rather behind us, but now they're much better than us in terms of urban design and city building. And they learned the lessons, and they asked the right questions, and they found the solutions themselves. This is in one generation, so it can be done. We have to believe in ourselves. We have to rely on ourselves for the solutions. And finally, I just want to make a small reference to Philippine heritage libraries and libraries in general. It's not just civic spaces that we need back in our cities. It's also civic buildings. We need libraries and cultural centers and museums. They are essential to our cities as repositories of our culture and knowledge. And that without these palaces of the people, we will be lost forever. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you, thank you. We couldn't end it better. So, thank you to our three speakers, Sir Paulo, Doc Noel, and Doc Meloy, for joining us today. As mentioned earlier, this activity is part of Liberation War and Hope, FHL's commemorative events for the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, which also includes the library's virtual exhibition War Through the Eyes of the Child on Google Arts and Culture. Please visit it by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to bit.ly FHL-war-child. You may also visit FHL's YouTube channel to view the previous Liberation Talks webinars. Please go to bit.ly FHL on YouTube. This webinar will be uploaded there as well. We would like to thank the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines for supporting this event. Please do not forget to like the FHL social media pages for updates. Follow the Filipinas Heritage Library, Ayala Foundation, Ayala Museum, and the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please visit the library's website at www.filipinaslibrary.org.ph to know more about its Filipiniana collections and to access its online library. Some of the images that you saw today can be accessed there as well. For materials on World War II in the Philippines, please check out the Roderick Hall collection at rodhall.filipinaslibrary.org.ph. Again, thank you everyone. We hope you learned a lot from this webinar from our three wonderful speakers. Please stay safe, stay healthy. Until next time. Bye.